Step 12, search for appropriate illustrations. A summary of this step. Your illustrations need to support your points from the passage, especially the big idea of the sermon. An opening illustration is particularly useful for drawing your congregation into the passage and providing a bridge between the contemporary world and the world of the Bible. Introduction. Stuart Olliott writes, an illustration is a word picture that sheds light or luster on something. It's a window which lets light into a dark room. Many people today are not very good with words, he writes. They find abstract logic and theoretical reasoning very hard to cope with. Deep, sustained arguments leave them bewildered. Which is why illustrations are so important in our preaching. Tim Keller writes, the essence of a good illustration is to evoke a remembered sense experience and bring it into connection with a principle. That makes the truth real, both by helping listeners better understand it and by inclining their hearts more to love it. How to write good illustrations, understanding the purpose and value of illustrations. First of all, then, the purpose of an illustration. We can use illustrations in our preaching, first of all, to clarify an explanation, to make it clearer. Secondly, we can use illustrations to reinforce an explanation, to make the point stronger. Thirdly, we can use illustrations to arouse interest. So at the beginning of a sermon, we can use an opening illustration to draw the congregation into the theme of the sermon. And then we can recall attention as well. Later in the sermon, we can bring people back to the main point again using an illustration. Number 4, we can allow the listener time to relax and to have a rest. You see, we can't bombard people with information for 40 minutes and expect them to concentrate carefully for the whole time. We must give them opportunities to come up for air, and an illustration provides that sort of opportunity. Number 5, illustrations can reveal something of the speaker. See, people need to see something of our lives, not just our words. That's what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. He writes this about the Thessalonians, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. You see, that the congregation need to see that although they probably only see us at church on Sunday, we live in the real world just like them. Preaching requires us not only to share our thoughts as preachers, but share our lives as preachers. Number 6, we can use illustrations to appeal to the emotions as well as to the mind. You see, we really want people to hear the music of the passage. We want them to feel the passage as well as to understand it. And a good illustration can do that. So if we're preaching about the cross and the love of Jesus, we can tell a story about sacrificial love that helps those listening to understand the cross and to feel it emotionally. And then number 7, we can use illustrations to allow for the various learning styles of the audience, of the congregation. You see, some people learn better through illustrations than they do through just hearing a set of propositions spelt out. They need concrete examples, not abstract thoughts. So, for example, you can quote John chapter 14, verse 6 in your sermon, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. But that same point can be powerfully illustrated by telling the story of someone whose life was turned around by meeting Jesus and experiencing the truths of that verse for themselves. Olliott writes, what people see, they remember. What people see with their minds, they also remember. That's the way we are built. But let's think for a moment about why illustrations in sermons sometimes don't achieve any of those purposes, about why illustrations fail. Illustrations fail when they don't illustrate the point that's being made. Make sure that the point of the illustration is the point that you're trying to teach from the passage. Don't just tell a story for the sake of telling a story. It can actually leave people more confused at the end than they were when you started. It shouldn't need to be said, but sometimes it's worth stating the obvious. Here's the fundamental rule of illustrating. Use the illustration to fit the point of the passage. Do not twist the passage to fit the illustration. Illustrations fail when they distract from the point. Now, that might happen in a number of ways. Illustrations can distract from the point when they're factually incorrect. When I started preaching, I once spoke in a sermon about spontaneous combustion instead of internal combustion. Now, one is how an engine works, the other is the mysterious phenomenon where people spontaneously burst into flames. Quite different and quite confusing for the congregation when you get them muddled up. I can still remember the smile on the face of one of the elders after the service as he pointed out my mistake. If you get the date wrong for an historical event, or you pass on an incorrect piece of information, then our illustration can actually distract people from the point of the message. It's really important that we do our research well, recognizing that people can check out our information on Google, even during the sermon. Illustrations can distract from the point when you tell an incomplete story, a story that leaves people wondering about the story rather than the point you're trying to make. So you move on in your preaching, maybe to another part of the passage, but the congregation still have their heads in the story trying to work out what has just happened, what you've just said to them. Illustrations can distract from the point when the joke isn't funny. Try to be aware of people's circumstances. So, for example, because of its double meaning, it is actually quite funny in English to say, Mrs. Smith is at death's door. Please pray that the Lord will pull her through. But not so funny if people in the congregation are nursing terminally ill relatives or facing bereavement. Illustrations can distract from the point when they're too complicated or too long People just get lost in the detail. Make sure that you only include the most important details for the point you're trying to make. To use a picture, cut back the undergrowth so that people can see the garden. Number 3, illustrations fail when there are too many of them. When that happens, people in the congregation just lose sight of the passage and the overall direction of the sermon. Number 4, illustrations fail when they draw attention to the speaker, the preacher, rather than Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, Paul writes that in his preaching to the Corinthians, he resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Be careful that your illustration is not self-promoting. Well, next, try to use a variety of illustrations in your preaching. First of all, use stories, especially about people. People like stories about people. Secondly, use poems and song lyrics. Thirdly, use appropriate jokes. Fourthly, use real-life examples that people can relate to, like going to the refrigerator and finding a bad egg hiding among the good eggs. We mustn't be surprised to find the same in the church. False teachers hiding amongst God's people. Number 5, use word plays. Aim sometimes to make your point by surprise. So if you're preaching from 1 Samuel 17 verse 18, you can talk about David taking 10 cheeses for the bigger cheese. Finally then, here are 8 tips for giving better illustrations in your preaching. Number 1, be yourself and use your own humour. You don't need to be Trevor Noah or whoever your favourite comedian is to make people smile in the congregation. The most important thing is to be a sanctified version of yourself. Don't pretend to be someone you're not. Number 2, be an observer of life. Take note of the things that strike you in everyday life and then use them to illustrate your points. It's often the most down-to-earth illustrations that make the most impact. Number 3, collect illustrations. Have an illustrations file where you collect interesting stories and other illustrations. Number 4, start your sermon early enough. Start your preparation early enough so that you can be looking out for suitable illustrations. If you can, use suitable stories from that week, from the newspapers that illustrate biblical ideas. Number 5, beware saying things off the cuff, spontaneously, especially jokes. They can go badly wrong. Sometimes spontaneous illustrations work well, but just because something pops into your mind when you're standing in front of the congregation doesn't mean that it's necessarily worth saying. It might just get you into trouble. It might just offend someone in the congregation. Number 6, never tell stories where you are the hero. There's always a danger that you become the focus rather than Christ. Number 7, tell stories about your mistakes, not other people's. It's okay to poke fun at yourself, but it's often not okay to poke fun at other people's mistakes. especially people you know personally, especially those who are in the room with you. It's usually safer to get people to laugh at you. Well, number 8, get permission for illustrations that involve other people you know. For example, that's particularly important with your children when they become teenagers. Even if you have the best story about your children that perfectly illustrates the passage you're preaching from, don't use it if it's going to publicly embarrass them. Ask their permission first. You don't want to win the prize for the best sermon illustration, but lose your child from the Christian faith. Well, finally, we must make sure we've asked and answered these questions for this step, questions to ask ourselves as preachers. Am I collecting illustrations? Do I need an opening illustration to connect the congregation with the text? Have I used illustrations that bring the point home? Is my illustration relevant to my subject? Have I carefully researched my illustration to know that the facts are correct? Have I used enough illustrations to keep the congregation engaged with the subject? And then finally, are my illustrations appropriate?